Every good parent knows there's only one place that you can go for peace this holiday season. You know where it is? The bathroom. Because it has a lock on the door. It has everything we need, water and that lock on the door. It's the grown-up place for a grown-up timeout. So this week we're talking about the peace, though, that comes with the presence of Christ in our life. And we don't need a lock to have it. Remember last week we talked about John the Baptist, who came to prepare our hearts so that we would empty them of all the stuff so it could be replaced with the joy that was coming. And this week we need to prepare our relationships so we're ready for the peace that is ready to come. See, the scriptures today are going to take us back, not when John the Baptist was starting, but when he was still inside his mother's womb. So we're going to take a look back at a time when Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant, and Elizabeth is a cousin with Mary, who is Jesus' mom. This story talks about Mary, who just learned from the angel Gabriel that she has this unexpected and unplanned pregnancy, and it's a complicated pregnancy. It's complicated because Joseph, her fiancé, is not the father. That makes the pregnancy very complicated. It's complicated because who else would believe the truth of what really just happened? So Mary, poor Mary, she lives now in two worlds. She has the holy world with honor and the human world with dishonor. The difference is the perspective. It's which side of that locked door are you on? The holy side is God's world, where she is seen as the deliverer, the one who will give birth to the person who will give us peace on earth. And the human side of the door only sees the dishonor from an illegitimate and unplanned pregnancy, which, by the way, is punishable by death. Same situation, two different sides of the same locked door. Mary is young. She's not a fool. She knows which side she thinks she's on. And so she flees. She runs to the home of her cousin Elizabeth. Now, they're not like next door. Nazareth to the Judean hill country where Elizabeth is at is about 80 to 100 miles. And by foot, which we think she probably would have done, she probably would arrive in about 5 days. It's far enough away so that Mary could hide. She could think. She could figure out what to do next. It's the best thing she could do for a locked door. And so we're going to look in the Gospel of Luke. And this is chapter 1, beginning with verse 39. This is right after the angel Gabriel gives her the news. So Mary got up and she hurried to a city in the Judean highlands. She entered Zacharias' home and greeted Elizabeth. Now, when Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. And with a loud voice, she just blurted out, "God has blessed you above all women, and he has blessed the child you carry. Why do I have this honor that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as I heard your greeting, the baby in my womb jumped for joy. Happy is she who believed that the Lord will fulfill the promises he made to her." Who but Elizabeth would have believed Mary? These two women are bonded by more than blood. They're bonded in this miraculous pregnancies, and they share this common angel, Gabriel, who both explain the news to them and reveals their fate. That these two very insignificant women are each chosen for a special role in the redemptive story. They have adjoining roles in this new chapter of salvation that's going to bring the Prince of the Peace to the world that they've been waiting for. But I have to admit, Elizabeth recognized it, but would you and I recognize a sense of peace if it were right in front of us? Yet Elizabeth recognizes the Messiah when Mary enters her home. Even before Mary blurts out what happened, she just knows. And she knows that she is carrying the Prince of Peace. And then for a while, it's only these two women. We don't really get this part, but for a while, only these two women really knew the Prince of Peace was coming. Peace. It comes first when we recognize that the peacemaker is among us, and then peace comes when we respond to the peacemaker with our relationships. So it's very subtle. Peace begins when Elizabeth welcomes Mary into her home. Mary was in distress. She had high needs, and she allowed her to come into her home, even though there was a risk for Elizabeth to do so. See, peace of Christ started in the womb of Mary. It allows us to see what God sees, not what human sees. See, we don't see an unwed mother through God's eyes. We see a God's child coming in the world, don't we? We don't see parents who are pulling their child in jeopardy, fleeing. We see a family desperately protecting their child from the violent regime, which was King Herod. And after they left Bethlehem, he massacred children in front of their parents. We don't see a band of immigrants pushing across the border. We see a family of God that is arriving in Egypt seeking refuge. See, Christ did not come into our world to judge people by human standards, but by God's standards. God's morality is different than our morality. In God's morality, he sees us as children of his own image. In our morality, we have rules and laws that we decide what's right and wrong. See, peace on earth, peace that we seek is a quality of heaven, just like love, joy, hope. Peace on earth, peace from heaven comes to earth. The God-like peace comes to earth. Peace is not just a state of being, not how we have our inner peace, but how we choose to relate to each other. It turns out that peace only comes when our relationships are at peace. Wouldn't you agree? Peace only comes when you have peaceful relationships. And that includes families and friends and neighbors and ethnic groups that we don't know and strangers and governments. Peace will always elude us if we don't let the peace of heaven that fills us with Christ into our heart. And so I'm going to ask you, do you have any relationships that could use some peace of Christ this Christmas? I see some of you nodding your heads. So as you ponder that, I want you to think about these words. For God so loved the world. You know that verse? But do you know the next verse? For God did not send his Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him, through his presence. So if God didn't send the Prince of Peace into the world to judge others by human morality, why should we? Think about that when you talk about the relationships that need some peace. See, as a child of God, not only do we acknowledge that Christ is in our life, but then we have to respond. And we have to respond first by the needs of others, like Elizabeth did to Mary, to be safe, to be fed, to be clothed, to be given shelter, the need to be loved and respected, the need to be able to provide food for your family and all those things, to be able to be healthy and have medical care as you need it, to not be abandoned or forgotten. Those are human needs, very basic human needs. And you know wars are fought when the basic needs of someone else is either ignored by choice or ignorance or indifference. And you know, left to our own devices, our relationships could break the world with our broken relationships. Left to our own devices, we could break the world. And this is why we need that peace of a Savior to save us from ourselves. Now, I was way too young for this, but in October of 1962, some of you might remember this, the United States was in a Cold War. And in that Cold War, they were now, in the October of 62, in a standoff with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those missiles in Cuba were pointed at us. Noel Regney was a musical composer, and he lived in New York. And everybody was nervous and scared because they didn't know how far away some of those could go. And they were listening to the news to see if they'd been annihilated or not. That's how bad it was. They kept the radio on to find out if the missiles had been fired and that they'd lost somebody in Florida. He saw the faces of the people in New York, and they weren't smiling. No one was happy. The mood was incredibly tense. And on this evening, he was walking home in the cool, crisp air, and he saw these two mothers pushing their babies in strollers. And these two babies were looking at each other, and they were innocently smiling, totally oblivious to what was happening in Cuba. They had no idea that the desperate situation that they were in. And with Christmas just around the corner, Regni was inspired to write these words, and you might remember them. Said the night wind to the little lamb, "Do you see what I see? Way up in the sky, little lamb, a star dancing in the night with a tail as big as a kite." Now the little lamb was the child in the stroller looking up into the night air. That dancing star, which we oftentimes think is the Bethlehem star, is really a missile in disguise, dancing in the night. The song was recorded originally by Bing Crosby. And if you listen to the original recording, it has the battle drums in the background, the snare, just in the background, reminding you that we were at war. The song goes on with the little lamb talking to a shepherd boy, and the shepherd boy is capitalized. And he asks him to listen to the sound rising above the trees, which is symbolic for the sound of people crying out for peace. The shepherd then confronts the king, who is in his warm palace, to recognize all the children who are shivering in the cold. And the king, who then recognizes the overwhelming hopelessness of the situation they are in, then begs the people everywhere to pray for peace to the real Christ child, who brings goodness and light to the darkness. When that song was released, it said that people understood what those words meant, and people were crying in the streets. The presence of Christ reminds us that peace begins with Christ in our heart and an extension to one another in our relationships. Peace begins when we see the needs of our adversaries, when we strive to meet the most basic human needs that they have. We see it from our perspective, but when we have Christ in our hearts, we see it from Christ's perspective. Peace begins when the dancing star is transformed into the Bethlehem star. Howard Thurman is an American theologian and a peacemaker, and he set the movement, the standards for nonviolent protests after he met Gandhi. He was so moved by the idea that Christmas could bring about change. He wrote this poem that says, "When the song of the angels is stilled." When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and the princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flocks, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart.